So let me float this out there. I think it's crazy. It's a crazy, silly idea, but I think it's worth discussing because there's really only a couple options with Jalen right now. SECfans.com coming at you with a quick hitter. We're going to do some of this throughout the offseason, maybe a little bit of change of pace from what we've been doing, which is, longer podcasts and longer observational videos. We're going to talk about some about personnel, some about teams. We want to help bridge that gap between the offseason and, August, because it's a long one for college football fans. We want to give you some meat to chew on. We did take a little break, but we're back in action, and we're going to, no set schedule, but we're going to be bringing content to you all off season. Of course, I've got Josh with me here. We're going to both get nerdy with you today and in future podcasts and videos. We want to talk today about Jalen Hurts. But before we get into it, I want to remind everybody, if you like it, give us a like. If you love it, we'd love a subscribe, especially if you like content like this, because we're going to be bringing more to you. So, all right, Josh. So earlier this week, we had a little bit of news with Nick Saban coming out and saying he'd love to find a spot in the Alabama offense, a role for both quarterbacks where both Tua and Jalen could play. And on its face, I thought, okay, that's great for Alabama, because I think if Tua ends up being the starter, which he probably will be, teams are going to game plan for Tua all week, and they can bring Jalen in to do what he does, which we saw when teams weren't game planning for Jalen early on. I'm thinking the Ole Miss game, even USC game, his debut, when they didn't know how to attack him, he was lethal. So I think that's great for Alabama. My concern is, what about Jalen? If he wants to be a quarterback on the next level in the NFL, does this give him the opportunity to showcase that he's fixed the things that we've seen are a problem for Jalen, meaning being able to throw at an NFL level, read defenses at an NFL level, and react, and not have those mental breakdowns on the light when the lights are brightest? Does that help him if he's just coming in and running a package or two, sort of like Tebow his first year? Or are there ways in that role that he can still showcase his skills and still be an NFL quarterback going forward?
I think the short answer is it all comes down to how he's used, right? The tendency to a lot of people would be to say, well, if he wants to play quarterback at the next level, he needs to go to another school so he can get more reps, play more quarterback, and move on. I think maybe that's a little bit misguided. He's played 2 years of college football, and due to the fact that Alabama reached the postseason, he's played a lot of games. And so there's a lot of tape on Jalen Hurts. It's not like he needs game experience at this point. What he needs is quality reps and good tape performing at a high level as a drop back passer. Now, you talking about having a package, there's good and bad there. If they put him in and they had him run handful of plays and had him try to do that at a high level with RPO concepts, I mean, theoretically, it could help him for the next level. But I think the problem is, more than likely, you need a guy that's a change of pace from someone that's already an elite thrower. So you basically want to use Jalen Hurts as a 230-pound battering ram, more than likely, and focus on his running ability, because Tua is such a good passer. And I think the problem is, I think Tua is elite at his position throwing the football. And we can get into that in a minute, just how statistically good he is. But it limits Jalen's opportunities, because you just can't put him in there to run a regular offense. I think the problem is, as I alluded to earlier, okay, if I'm admitting the fact that it's probably not a great position from the NFL, you have to get away from the idea of thinking, well, if this doesn't work out well, then he needs to do something different because it'll be better. I'm not so sure of that. If he goes to a lot of other offenses, they're going to use him as even as much or more of a system guy than Alabama would be in that package example. And in a lot of offenses, if he were to go to Auburn and do the unthinkable and run the Gus Malzahn offense, one, I don't know that he would actually take the starting job from Stidham, but if he did do it, he's going to be running the Nick Marshall offense, right? And that offense was good enough for Nick Marshall to try to be a defensive back in the NFL. It isn't a good offense to try to prepare you to be a receiver. So a lot of the teams you would think of Jalen Hurts going to aren't going to do any better of a job. Maybe he could go somewhere and run an air raid offense, but I think most air raid teams would be hard pressed to take him as an air raid quarterback. Maybe he goes to Oklahoma State, but I just don't think he's a great fit for a team like that.
It's interesting. It's interesting you bring up going to another school. I think Lane Kiffin has been openly campaigning to get him down there in Florida. But, I could see him going. I don't know that he can win a QB competition at a school that racks up a ton of points and relies on a quarterback to really get it done. I could see him going to a Florida Atlantic and winning the job there, and maybe putting up a lot of numbers. But doesn't that bring us back to the same problem he had at Alabama, where at Florida Atlantic or some other directional school, he's going to be playing weaker competition, and we've seen Jalen from the mental aspect, where when he knows he's playing lesser competition and there's no fear of him losing a national championship or an SEC championship, he's actually even a lot better passer, and he sees the defense a lot better. But we've already got a ton of tape on him doing that, so I don't even know if that helps him, even if he is the starting quarterback and does put up good numbers, because he's already done that against first time of the year tomato cans at Alabama.
I certainly think it's true. I mean, from my perspective, I wouldn't take a whole lot from it. And, I guess if you want a one sentence takeaway, my perspective on this is I view him the same way coming out of a package at Alabama as I would a full season at another school, unless he was substantially more productive at the other school. And, the fact that he plays more is kind of irrelevant. It's going to be kind of the same result. But I think you do have to consider the fact that he probably would be more productive for the reasons you're talking about. And it's the fact that if you're that kind of quarterback and you play against that kind of competition, you tend to be more successful. And we've talked about this a lot on the show, and we've been doing this for a few years now, that the spread offense is very, very good at getting you 9, 10, 11 wins in a season. Not real good at actually winning a title. And the reason for that is the closer you get to the championship game and the better the teams you play are, the more you face teams that are essentially NFL defenses. There's a reason Colin Kaepernick is not a starting quarterback in the NFL. We can have a debate on whether or not he should be a backup quarterback in the NFL, but there's a reason he's not the starter. And that's that there's a really hard ceiling to what that style of quarterback can do when you're facing elite teams that have a ton of time to prep, that do a very good job of coaching their players, that are very fast and athletic. You can't get the edges. You can't run over them. You have to be able to stretch the field vertically. And, with your permission, I'd like to talk about, a trend here. And, I think we noted this before. We were talking about this before the call. There's a pretty good trend with quarterbacks in championship games and the way things have been going, running versus passing, where running quarterbacks have not been very successful in championship games.
Yeah, let's get into that because that's something I've never even considered to research.
So, yeah, I went back and it's pretty simple, right? And a lot of what we talk about statistically on the show is not uber complicated. We try not to, we use advanced stats to some degree, but we try to essentially pull statistics or information that we think is relevant or useful to someone that's trying to look at this and understand what's going on in the college football landscape. If you go back to 2005, okay, so essentially the past 12 years of college football, by my calculation, there were 9 quarterbacks that had a decided running advantage over the opposing quarterback in the game. The first 2 examples of that really came about in 2005 and 2008. 2005 was obviously the Vince Young Leinart year. Of course, I'm going by the season number, year number, not the championship game year. That I know it's played in January, but I always refer to the season. Vince Young really, I think, kick-started this in 2005 with his performance against USC, which was almost a virtuoso performance. I think teams weren't prepared for that style of offense at that time. There's a lot of man coverage. There's other questions of the fact that I think people really underestimate how good Texas was as a whole. They had a very good defense that year, and everybody just thought USC was unbeatable. You go fast forward a couple of years, 2006, you did have the Tebow leak thing. I don't really consider that really a dual threat offense so much. It was more of a passing game with Leak, and Troy Smith's offense wasn't all that different. Again, next year, Flynn and Beckman, still more or less traditional offenses. And then it picked up hard. 2008, Tim Tebow and the spread offense at Florida beat Sam Bradford and one of the most prolific offenses in recent memory. Again, both system teams, but you had a run spread quarterback that was able to sort of bully teams throughout the season and win a championship against a team that was favored at the time in Bradford's Oklahoma. And at that point, I think everybody tried to start emulating what Urban Meyer in Florida were doing. But I think not enough attention has been made to the simple fact of how have those teams done in championship games. If you look at, who had an advantage, 2009, Greg McElroy versus Colt McCoy. A little bit cheating because McCoy gets injured, but the better runner in that game, McCoy, loses. 2011, McCarron versus Jordan Jefferson. Jefferson, the better runner, he loses. 2012, McCarron versus Golson. Golson, the better runner, he loses. 13, Winston versus Marshall. Marshall loses. 14, Cardale Jones versus Mariota. Mariota loses. 15, Coker versus Watson. Watson loses. 16, Watson versus Hurts. Hurts was actually the better runner than Watson, and he loses. So, in my view, from 2008, the past 10 years, essentially, 7 times in those 10 years, we've had a real edge of one team over the other in terms of a running quarterback. Every one of those times for the past 10 years, the team with a better runner has lost. And I think one of the interesting things is there's one year where you had 2 really good runners, Cam Newton and Darren Thomas, 2010. Those teams came in as, I think, both top 5 offenses in terms of scoring production. Phenomenal offenses. Nobody could stop them. And that championship game was bizarrely a slugfest.
With not great defenses.
Right. With what were not considered to be great defenses. And what I saw from that was teams with a lot of time to prepare, with motivation, that had pretty good defenses, were able to stop what were excellent offenses. And I don't know what you take from that, but in my view, that was many, many years ago the first sign that maybe these spread offenses would have trouble in championship games with time off, extra time to prepare, all that jazz, a little bit like the option, a little bit of other stuff too, just in terms of as the quality of opponents goes down. And last year we almost saw a repeat of this trend because you had Jalen Hurts versus Jake Fromm. Hurts was clearly the better runner, and Alabama was going to lose that game at halftime. I had pretty well called it, and we were having a discussion. We talked about all through the playoffs giving a score of Alabama with and without Tua Tagovailoa playing in the game, and I'm sure a lot of people thought that was crazy at the time. But the reason we said that was we felt like Hurts was at a disadvantage because of these trends. Well, sure enough, Hurts would have lost the game versus Fromm. But what Alabama did is, Saban basically saw this trend, realized that he needed somebody that could throw the ball vertically, and took him out for Tagovailoa. Why do I have what seems like a long tangential discussion there? Well, it's because of what you said about what would happen if Jalen Hurts goes to Florida Atlantic. I think he could be very successful. He could maybe get to a championship game, maybe gets consideration for the playoff the way UCF did last year. And there's a lot of precedent to the fact that if you have a running offense, if you have a mobile quarterback, you have an advantage, I think, in making it to the playoff, because teams are continually very successful when they have really dangerous runners at the quarterback position. But what I'm trying to point out is when you actually get to the playoff, when you actually have to play a top 5 team or a top 5 defense, those running quarterbacks tend to get shut down more often than not. And even in the playoff years, I think the playoff has exacerbated that because now, not only if we're saying this is a trend, if we're saying it's really hard for a run spread team to beat a good defense, you could end up in a situation like 2010 where you have 2 spread teams play each other. But now, 2014 Alabama, which had a pretty heavy short passing game, not a whole lot of run spread, but very much a short spread bubble screen offense that had been very prolific. Well, they had to play 2 games if they wanted to win the championship. And they got knocked off the first round against Cardale Jones, who had come in. And, if you look at just 2 years later, Jalen Hurts comes in and they win the first game against Washington, who they were basically able to beat because their defense completely shut Washington down. They were able to score defensively, and they got 1 offensive touchdown. That might have won in the game, won them a championship in previous years, but in 2016 they had to go on and play Deshaun Watson. Point being, I think Hurts could be very successful in FAU statistically. I think he could win a lot of games, but he's probably not going to win a title. And if you're a team that wants to win a championship, that actually needs to go undefeated, now you really have to strongly gear your team to, how do I win those 2 games in a row at the end of the season? That's where Jalen Hurts is going to struggle.
Right.
So,
And
yeah,
it's funny because everybody keeps saying, how do you bench a guy that's 25-2, and how do you not consider in your future plans a guy that's 25-2? And what people don't realize is at Alabama, they could win most of those games with their third string quarterback. And I'm not saying Jalen hasn't contributed to them winning, but the thing that matters is the two. The thing that matters is the 2 or 3 games at the end of the year where he's consistently shown that he's struggled. So yes, Tua next year might win them all, and Jalen might would have won all but 1 or 2 of those, but the gap there is so huge. So let me float this out there. I think it's crazy. It's a crazy, silly idea, but I think it's worth discussing because there's really only a couple options with Jalen right now. One, to go to another team. I think we've already discussed how that's not great for his NFL prospects. 2, switch positions. I don't think he's a running back. He could play tight end, wide receiver, something in the secondary. But he's got to do that now. If he's going to switch positions and get ready for the NFL, he needs to do that right now so he can show it. I know a couple of guys have done it at quarterback and gone on the NFL and changed positions there. I think Jalen needs to do it now. But here's something I'd like to get your opinion on. What if he redshirted? What if Tua comes in on fire in the spring, wins the starting job, and stays healthy all year? You didn't take Jalen. Most quarterbacks that come in don't start true freshmen, so you still got that red shirt out there. So he could redshirt this year, have 2 more years to play, because I don't think they needed Jalen Hurts to play mop-up duty. That's almost an abuse of his skills, I think. And then maybe, because my thought is he skipped ahead a few steps. They put him in to play quarterback as a true freshman, and he skipped through some of that maturation process where he didn't have to deal with the stress. He didn't have to worry about, Nick Saban making him super conservative and just going out there and being kind of a game manager with legs. Maybe if he redshirts, he could do 2 things. One, sort of some of the pressure comes off and he can go through the organic steps of getting back to that quarterback place, starting quarterback in the SEC place. And 2, it gives him the ability to work on his mechanics, his throwing, and his timing, and all the things that he struggles with in terms of mental, physical combination and throwing the ball that he might have gotten if he spent a year or 2 as an understudy to a really great quarterback. Is that an absolutely crazy idea, or does it have some merit and it's worth discussing?
actually, it's an interesting one because I never really even thought about it, but I think it has a lot of merit. Tua Tagovailoa is, in my view, a 3-year quarterback, and if you looked at his statistics overall in the season, his QB rating was 174.97. He threw a decent number of passes last year, I think about 70. And if you were to place that nationally, Tua's QB rating would have been 3rd ahead of Mason Rudolph. So, yeah, was he needing backup time, mop up time, etc.? Sure, but you have to understand, and there's a reason we were looking for him to play. Jalen's biggest issue is that Tua Tagovailoa is an NFL quarterback and a 3-year player. In my view, almost certainly a 3-year player. Jalen is still a very good quarterback, and he may have limitations, like we've talked about currently. But if you gave him what at that point would be another 2 years to sit as a backup, which is probably what he should have been doing all along, and really learn how to play quarterback, that's probably his best shot at progression. Because we've talked about what would happen if he went to a Florida Atlantic. I think he would be very successful. I think he'd put up a lot of numbers. I don't think he would really advance as a quarterback in the way that he needs to play in the NFL. And I think one of my personal criticisms of Lane Kiffin in Alabama is that he was very successful in how he used Jalen Hurts for most of the season. He did a very poor job of preparing their offense for how they would need to use Jalen Hurts at the end of the season. And I think this past year, for most of the year, Dable at Alabama had tried to use Jalen Hurts as a real quarterback. They'd struggled at times, and then they'd run the stuff they were comfortable with and kind of taken the lead in the 3rd quarter. They did this over and over again. The best thing for Jalen Hurts would be to never have that pressure of having to do what, quote, he's good at. He needs to sit there and just practice doing the things he's not good at as a quarterback and refine those skills, because he needs to rely, unfortunately, on a lot of the things he's not great at And my biggest thing with him is release speed. It takes him far too long to get into his stance to set his feet and throw. He has an elongated stance when he's as a thrower, which leads to an elongated throwing motion. And all his decision making seems slower than I think it is because he's a very bright guy. Because he knows from the time that he sees the player to the time the ball goes out, it's going to take a second and a half. The NFL level, that can't fly. You can't have that kind of throwing motion. You don't have enough time in the pocket to do that. Tua Tagovailoa seems more instinctive, but it's really because he can get the ball out with such velocity that as soon as he sees a guy open, he can just react, where Jalen has to do a lot more anticipation. Again, Jalen, the only way to fix that is to spend time working on good mechanics, get rid of bad habits. And if he's playing every snap, he's going to reinforce the bad habits he already has. He's not going to fix the problems he has. So yeah, I think it has a lot of merit. I think if he wants to be an NFL quarterback, it's probably his best shot is to not be on the field, not reinforcing bad habits, but instead be on the practice field working on changing his mechanics and changing his release and working on things mentally so that when he comes back and steps back on the playing field, he can be a different player with new habits, with a new release and new technique that fixes a lot of his previous issues. That said, it's also a risk because he has 1 year to play as a quarterback. If it doesn't pan out, then he may be a little bit stuck. And I'll give a little bonus point here. I know it's a question you haven't gotten to yet, but my view of Jalen Hurts is I see him as a Tanner McAvoy. Tanner McAvoy was a safety at Wisconsin, 6'6", 230 pounds, a high level athlete. A lot of I think the weirdest thing with Hurts is people want to compare him to a lot of the other random dual threat quarterbacks that have been successful. The Braxton Millers. Jalen Hurts does not even resemble Braxton Miller athletically. He's a totally different player. He's a long strider. He's big. He's physical. And you don't want to put him as a scat back, and you don't want to put him as a slot receiver. That's not his build. He's more of a safety than anything. And I think one of the problems and the reasons I'm bringing that up is it's a little more of a risk in my view for him to play as a quarterback all the way through his redshirt senior season if he's not going to transition. Because Nick, when you play a speed position, like Nick Marshall transitioning to receiver, defensive back, I think it's a little easier of a transition because the nature of the position, it relies more on sheer athleticism. Jalen at his size, I think has to be more of a possession receiver or more of a safety because he's just so big.
What about tight end?
And yeah, tight end. But my point here is those are all technique positions. If you're a tight end, you have to know how to block. That requires a lot of technique. If you're a possession receiver, you have to be very precise in your routes. If you're a safety, you have to be very comfortable in coverage. None of those positions are easy transitions. I think a lot of the comparisons with him are misguided because they keep comparing him to these small, fast, quick players that were quarterbacks that transitioned. He's not that kind of guy. And, I pointed out McAvoy because I think he's the one guy that had that kind of build and has, made a career for himself. Is now basically the number 4 receiver at Seattle. I think that's probably, in my opinion, his best route. And so my drawback from your suggestion of a redshirt senior, being a redshirt senior quarterback is probably absolutely his best way to be a quarterback to the NFL. I agree with that. I hadn't thought of it, but I agree with it. The problem is it's also maybe the worst thing in terms of eating up all the available time he has and not giving himself any opportunity to switch positions, given that I think he's going to need time in another position to be able to transition in a way a lot of the other guys did not.
All right, so let's wrap this up. We're going to make this one quick. We've got, we go long. That's what we do. At least this one's going to be long enough for some podcast listeners. If you had your way and you were and let's do two ways. So if you're in Jalen's head, what do you think of all the options we've talked about, either transferring to another school, switching positions, or redshirting to play quarterback at Alabama? Those are the 3 options. If you're Jalen Hurts, which one do you pick? If you're an NFL scout, which one do you want to see him pick? And we'll end on that.
If I'm Jalen Hurts, I think my first option is to transfer somewhere where I have a chance to start immediately in a pass first offense. That's kind of obvious. That's your best chance to be a passing quarterback. I think the number 2 option, if I'm looking at competing for the position with another guy that has a solid chance, or if I'm looking especially at the opportunity to go play for somewhere that's going to use me heavily as a runner, which I think Lane Kiffin would do at Florida Atlantic, My number 2 choice would be to redshirt. I think that's the best path, and this is me looking from the outside, probably not the way a college kid would think, but that's probably the best way to play quarterback at the next level. If I'm a scout, based of what I've seen, I'm probably not thinking that Jalen is probably going to be a quarterback. And what I want to see him do is switch positions because, yeah, it'd be great if he redshirts and turns around, but I don't, honestly, scouts don't really care whether you as an individual are successful. What they care about is, am I looking at a kid that's going to help my program or not? And from what we've seen on the field, I think most scouts would look at Jalen and go, man, this is an incredible athlete and a very smart kid that isn't necessarily a natural thrower. I really would love to see him in another position that makes use of all those abilities. And it'd be great if he can transition to being a natural thrower, but I more likely he's going to help my team in another manner.
So follow up on the scout question, and this is what we kind of touched on, but not really on the red shirt thing. Does it also concern you if you're a scout? Or is this the reality for a scout who's looking at game tape? Let's say Jalen red shirts and he has 1 year left to play after Tua. Really, you only care about 2 or 3 games worth of tape, right? Like, because you've seen Jalen torch other crappy teams. That means you're biding your time for 2 years for 2 or 3 games worth of tape. Is that fair?
That's probably fair.
Okay. All right. Anything else on Jalen Hurts and what you think that Alabama should do with him or what he should do with himself?
Well, I think from Alabama's perspective, you need to use him in whatever way he's best going to be able to contribute to the team. I mean, that's the way you handle it as a coaching staff. If that's incompatible with what he wants, then, he's got to make the decision of what he wants to do in his career. I think an interesting caveat to him is he played football under his father, who was a high school coach, and his brother was a big football player. And I remember a long time ago seeing an interview with him or some story pregame. And as I recall, he didn't really want to be a quarterback in high school. He ended up kind of having to be a quarterback because his high school football team didn't really have one. And his dad was the coach. He was a smart kid. They transitioned him to quarterback. He wanted to play receiver with his brother, who I believe actually was the quarterback on the team. So I think it's an interesting caveat. Everybody assumes that Jalen Hurts wants to play quarterback at the next level. And that's always kind of stuck out in my mind because I know I've seen an interview where it was suggested that at least in high school, he didn't really want to be a quarterback. So I think that's an interesting psychological point that everybody just assumes he wants to be a quarterback. And I'm sure he's competitive and he wants to succeed at whatever he's doing, but maybe that's not the position he actually most wants to play. So it will be interesting to see what his transition is. It'll be interesting to see what they do with him and what he chooses to do. But I really feel like he could be successful doing a lot of things. It's just going to be a matter of seeing how it plays out.
Yeah, I could see Jalen as just an absolutely brutal tight end or safety. I don't know if he's got hands or not, but just his build and what I've seen from his durability, I think he could play tight end or safety on the next level. All right, y'all. That's it for this quick hitter. We're going to bring some more of that throughout the season. We've also got some long-form kind of stuff that we've planned for the offseason. Last offseason, we sort of went dark for the whole offseason except for a little bit of draft stuff, which I do think we're going to do more draft stuff this year. But we have some of that in the works. So be looking forward to that. Anything that y'all want to talk about regarding Jalen Hurts, please do so in the comments. Let us know what you would do with Jalen Hurts, and let us know what you think Jalen Hurts could do, because those aren't necessarily the same thing. All right, y'all. Glad to be back at it. Thanks so much. Have a great week. God bless. Also, got my coffee-stained hat this week. BHAM hat is definitely coming back. My kid ran off with it, and I know y'all are missing it, so I needed to comment about it. Thanks so much, y'all.